Behold a map of Europe. And today we're gonna make a road trip from Italy, where we spent a lot of time, and we dabbled in Spain as well. And we're gonna go north, and we're gonna look at two different countries who are neighbors, um, who have very different cultures and very different religions, and as a result have very different works of art. And so I'll tell you a story. In 2013, during my spring break when teaching at the University of Wuj, I went to Paris. And I was in Paris for a week, and then I took a train to Amsterdam. And it was like the super cool high-speed train, and it had one stop. That stop was in Amsterdam. And to give you an idea, Amsterdam is about where G is on Belgium here. And so we stopped in Amsterdam, picked up people, I'm sure, and dropped off people, and whoosh, away we went to pardon me, I've said Amsterdam three times now. Antwerp. Went to Antwerp, which is here about in the G. So we made that super high-speed journey to Antwerp, dropped people off, picked people up, and then continued to the Netherlands and Amsterdam right there. So we're going to look at a painter working in Antwerp during the Baroque time frame, and then a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in the Netherlands, and primarily Amsterdam, but also in Delft. And so I want to show you a cool church. This is the Cathedral of Antwerp. And Antwerp is maybe one of the most cosmopolitan countries in the world. When I was there, I picked up this little like street map, and it said that there are people from over 290 or 209 countries who work in the government in Antwerp, which I was sort of amazed by. It's like every country imaginable is represented in the Belgian government in Antwerp. And this is a picture of the cathedral. And I don't even know when the cathedral was made. I'm guessing that this would be an early Baroque structure, or maybe late Renaissance, so 1575 to 1650. In front, or I should say, along the nave of that is a gigantic statue of this guy. His name is Peter Paul Rubens. And Peter Paul Rubens was a Belgian artist working in Antwerp in the early years of the 17th century. And he's a fascinating dude because when a young man, he actually goes to Italy to learn and study. And what you're looking at on the left-hand side is Caravaggio's entombment from 1603, and then Rubens's interpretation of that made just 8 years later. I mean, clearly, two things are true. As a young man, Rubens has got game, and secondly, within 8 years, or in his own lifetime, Caravaggio was acknowledged as one of the great masters of the Italian Baroque style. And so Rubens was copying his paintings and sort of absorbed some of those lessons and came back and utilized them for the remainder of his career. He paints a long time, and he has an enormous workshop that is filled with talented assistants who provide him with guidance in making these works. So this is a painting called The Elevation of the Cross. And to say that it's big is a little bit of an understatement. This thing is enormous. And if my dad saw this photograph, he would slap me for wearing a hat inside a church. I guess I forgot to take it off. But this thing is something like 20 foot square and 20 by 18 foot or something ridiculous, including large scale side panels. There's also another version on the other side of the church there. I mean, these things are really, really big. Number one. Number two. And I call your attention to the austerity of the church, because we'll talk about that in a second. Rubens, as a Flemish artist, is living in a Catholic part of Belgium. And as a result of this, there is absolutely no problems or quarrels with doing religious paintings, and that's going to change when we make the 60-mile trip from Antwerp to Amsterdam. This painting shows Christ being risen upon the cross, and here is a detail of that central panel. We'll spend most of our time looking at this right here. Now, as a way to think about this image, we could talk about it compositionally in terms of the movement of our eye. And if you were to look at this painting and just gaze at it for a second, I'm going to take a slurp of my coffee. I want you to look at it and think about the movement of your eye. Where does it start and where does it go? Now, there's no wrong answer. I'm not going to tell you your eye starts here and ends there, but I'll speak to myself. When I look at this painting, I think of it beginning in the lower right-hand corner, and you see like the head of an old man, and it then follows up that head to the next head, along a pair of shoulders to an arm, the brightly illuminated body of Christ, and then up through his head and his arm to this corner here. It seems that there's movement from lower right to upper left. You might not feel that same way. That's okay. You're not wrong. I'm just speaking to myself. What I do mean to suggest to you, however, is that Rubens has used in a really effective way a diagonal line to lead our eye somewhere, regardless of whether or not it goes from here to here for you or from there to there to you. Your eye probably doesn't do this, right? From lower left to upper right. So if your eye moved in this direction, Rubens has sort of achieved what he wanted to, and that is leading your eye from the bodies of the people who are lifting up Christ to the body of our Lord and Savior himself. So with this, we have a use of a diagonal line and many diagonal lines, compositionally, diagonally in arrangement to lead our eye somewhere. Now let's think about this in a different kind of way, because this is a powerfully moving object, but it is so in a way that at first you don't understand. So I call your attention to when and where Christ lived and when and what Christ did things. So Christ was a Jewish man who lived around the year 0. I think we can agree on that. And I'm not a theologian, but I feel good about this very broad designator. So let's think about Jewish men. Do you know how many gold medals the Israeli national basketball team have won? And the answer is 0. And the answer for this is kind of simple. Israeli men, as in terms of their genetics, are not taller than most people. So Christ was a Jewish guy, and I get it. Christ was also the Son of God, which gives him special genetics. But I think it's fair to say that Christ, alive 2,000 years ago, was probably under 6 foot and probably closer to 5'6" than he was 6'9". Right? There's a fabulous historian by the name of Brian Ward Perkins who wrote a history of the fall of Rome about a decade ago, maybe more ago. And one of the things he did was chronicle the decreasing size of Roman soldiers from the High Classical period to the 3rd century. And he was able to do this by looking at burial remains, right? That the average height of a Roman soldier around the year 125 was 5'7", and 200 years later it was 5'5". And that might seem like a lot, but it means that nutrition has gotten poorer. And if nutrition becomes poor, bodies become weaker. And so we know all kinds of things about the height of people who lived long ago. And what we know without doubt is that men on average right now are 6 inches taller than they were 2,000 years ago. I'm 6'1", which makes me slightly above average. But if I was 6'1", 2,000 years ago, I'd be a god. So Christ, let's put him at slightly above average. Let's put him at 5'9". Awesome, 5'9". 5'9" Jewish man, how much could he have weighed? There's no McDonald's, there's no Chipotle, there's no chips and salsa, there's no potato chips very broadly. Those are sort of my undoings. And there's also no cars. So Jesus doesn't have fast food. Jesus does not have potato chips. Jesus does not have a car to get him around the Holy Land. Jesus walks everywhere, except when he rolls on a donkey, which isn't that often. So would Jesus have been fat? Probably not. So we have a 5'9" Jewish man who gets a lot of exercise and doesn't eat any fast food. How much does that guy weigh? And I got to tell you, I have no idea. But let's just go crazy and say 160. All right. 160-pound, 5'9" Jewish man who exercises, but doesn't like work out, right? You think ever Jesus says he's gonna go to the gym? Like he was too busy to go work out. So he might have been thin, but I don't think he would have been muscled. All right, 160 pounds. Let's count the people who are lifting up this body. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 people to lift that body. But wait, you say, Brian, there's a wooden cross there. Yes, there is. Let's make the weight of the cross the same as the weight of the Christ. 160 times 2 is 320. So we now have 320 pounds. Now, the last time I taught this work of art at Louisiana Tech, there was a student in that class by the name of Chase Leonard. Chase Leonard's 6'3". Chase Leonard weighs 190 pounds. I'm guessing. I'll ask Chase next time I see him. Chase is bigger than Jesus in any case. And I'll be honest, I don't have the back muscles of this guy. I'm a relatively fit dude, I suppose. I've got a rowing machine. I'm kind of active on that. But I am more tennis player than weightlifter, to go back to our David discussion. And I had Chase come up to the front of the room. I asked Chase to put his arm around my neck, and I then picked up Chase. Now, I'll be honest, it wasn't easy for me. Chase was a big dude, but I could pick up Chase, and I could hold Chase and talk about this work for a good 30 seconds before I felt like my back was going to crumble. And I'm a 44-year-old guy who's, 175, 180 pounds. And I'm not a weightlifter. So if that be the case, if we have 10 guys, or however many I counted, let me go again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 9 guys here lifting this guy, lifting up Jesus in this cross. And my question is, if there's 9 of them and they're only lifting 320 pounds, why are they straining as I strained when picking up Chase's 190? And the answer for this is simple. They're not picking up the weight of Christ and the cross of Christ. That's not just what they're doing. They, in turn, are carrying and picking up the spiritual heft of Christ. It's the only possible explanation why you need 9 bodybuilders, or I guess 8 bodybuilders, 7 bodybuilders, and the old guys here to lift up this body. Right? Rubens, working in a Catholic country, is using all the tricks in his mighty artistic toolbox to convey the spiritual weight of Christ and not just the physical weight. And that idea is a really, really important one. So there we go. I did a Flemish painting. I'm delighted. And it's one of my favorite ones. And it's one of my favorite ones because here I am. Oh, there's my wife. There I am looking so happy about it. Let's go back to this because I have a delivery for all of you. I promised to talk about Dutch artistic production in the North, and now we get there. So what we're going to do over the course of the next, 1 or 2 minutes is look at Dutch painting from the Golden Age, from the 17th century. And some of the art makers who are a part of this movement have worked their way so prevalently into modern culture that they are almost known, but we don't know why. So for example, when I was in high school, there was a toothpaste. I don't even know if it still exists anymore, but it was called Rembrandt. It was a whitening toothpaste. It might have been one of the first whitening toothpastes. Rembrandt was a whitening toothpaste. There used to be a paint. It might not still exist, but it was when I was in elementary school. I haven't looked at it for a while. It was called Dutch Boy paint. So the Dutch culture is exceedingly well known for their painting culture. And not only that, but for a remarkably robust middle class. And so we're going to look at a couple of places that have an artistic explosion. Here's where I could have shown you Antwerp, Amsterdam, Antwerp. We're going to look at Amsterdam, which is where Rembrandt eventually settled, The Hague and Leiden, where he painted to begin with. And if I play my cards right, we'll go to Delft and we'll look at We'll look at some Vermeers as well. In order to understand some of the cool things we're looking at, we need to back up and separate ourselves from art and talk about some of the social groups that exist in Holland during this time frame. During the 17th century, we have, as I mentioned, a rising middle class that's becoming more and more affluent. And when you have a rising middle class, the rising middle class has discretionary income to buy things other than food, water, and shelter. And when this happens, you begin to buy the things that you covet. You covet the things you see every day, and you see the things every day that your friends have. And so this is a time also of social groups. We can think of them as being kind of like fraternities, a collection of brothers that are not related by blood, but by related by interest or by occupation. These organizations still exist in some parts of the world to this very day. For example, in 2010, I spent a month in Poland under the sponsorship of the Rotary Foundation. I know there are Rotary groups in some parts of Louisiana, but the Rotary is a collection of people. They all come together a couple times a month. They have lunch, they have meetings, they talk about stuff, and then they try to do good works for the community. The Rotary sponsored me and five other young-ish people, what was called a group study exchange. So we all went to Poland and learned about Poland and how people in Poland did whatever jobs it was that we had. Other social groups now are like the Lions Club, the Masons. I know there's a Masonic Lodge in Dubuque, even if it's no longer a Masonic Lodge. That's what the Guard of St. Hadrian's Society was. They were men who were all part of this group. It was a social group. There are other groups that are more professional, so you can imagine like the Art History Guild, for example. But this is a social group. And this, a self-portrait, group portrait done by Frans Hals, is a great example of what began happening in the 17th century. And that is 12 people would all get together. They'd all put in $300, which is 1/3 the cost of what a single portrait would have cost. And then they chip in and pay for an art maker to do a group portrait of the organization. And this portrait doesn't go in anyone's house, but instead goes in the community meeting space of the group. And so what you can see here is two examples of that. And I want to call your attention to the ways in which this object, this painting, looks different than many other group portraits we've looked at before. And so as a way of thinking about that, I want to go way back to an object we looked at long ago when we talked about Masaccio. And we looked at Masaccio's painting, The Tribute Money. And I will have to hunt it down. But let me show you the tribute money. Here it is, right? So a lifetime ago, when I was a TF for this class at Maryland, my professor, Dr. Prami, sort of when describing this, she said that it was an isocephalic composition. And to put cards on tables, Dr. Prami is a genius. Like, she's brilliant. I feel like I'm pretty smart, but I'm not smart like Dr. Prami, and that's why Dr. Prami is now the chair of American Studies at Yale. So she said this out loud, and I turned to one of the other TFs, and I was like, "What the hell did she say?" And she said it's an isocephalic composition. And I kept thinking, okay, so I had to fight through that. Iso kind of means the same. Cephalus is the Greek word for head. And the only reason I know this is because I was a physiology major in college. So isocephalic composition. I was like, oh yeah, the heads are all on the same level, which they are, right? Like if you had a chainsaw and a bad disposition, think about all the heads you could cut off all on one straight line. Whoosh, they're all gone. Isocephalic composition. I pause here to say that no art history professor should use the phrase isocephalic composition with a group of college freshmen unless they're going to explain it. This is not an isocephalic composition. As a matter of fact, this is like a dot dot to dot, right? Or it's like a bouncing ball, boing, 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 boing. Like your head bounces all over the place. And one of the things you notice when looking at this painting is that these men are all individuals. These men are all individual personalities. Uh, when I teach this and it's a big image on a screen and you can see their faces, I say, for example, there are people in this room you would like to get a drink with. Like, let me think. Like, I think this guy would be a good guy to go have a drink with. Like, his cheeks are already red, so he's on to his fourth glass of sherry. He seems pretty benign, doesn't seem to be a bad guy. If I was a young lady, I would avoid this guy. That dude looks like a creeper. These are all individuals, and Franz Hals, as a really gifted art maker and portraitist, is able to imbue a sense of personality. You get the idea that you know something about these men on the basis of only what the art maker has shown us. And I think that's a really important idea. So these kinds of group portraits become remarkably important during the Dutch Baroque period. I pause here to point out the obvious. There's no Jesus here. There's no Peter, no Paul, no Mary, no saints, no relics. This will be a time for secular, not religious art. And to put cards on table, our time at looking at Jesus is come to an end for the most parts. I should have announced this during our exploration of Bernini. I'm sorry. If you'd ever heard of any Dutch artist, you probably heard of Rembrandt. And so I brought in some Rembrandt self-portraits to show you the development of this man from young painter to optimist to rich, wealthy, famous guy to sad old man to man who is broke and alone. No matter where you go as an art maker, you're always there. And so you can always paint your own head. And Rembrandt paints himself dozens of times, dozens of times. And these self-portraits sort of play his story out in front of us. When I was at the Rijksmuseum, I was stunned at how small this painting is. Right? It's tiny. My favorite, this one, that's a well-to-do Rembrandt. This is a sad Rembrandt. His wife had died. His children had died. These are honest, soul-searching images of the art maker. He lives a long life. And it's one filled with incredible joys, successes, and triumphs, but it's also one that ends very sadly. Um, when I was 26, I was studying at the University of Maryland, and I went back to Wisconsin, where my mother was from and my grandmother still lived. And after my mother had passed away, she passed away in 2001. So in December of 2000. And in spring break of 2002, I went to go visit grandma, and we went out to the mausoleum where my mother was buried. Um, and I got the idea my grandmother went there often. My grandfather was there too. Um, and she brought a flower for my grandfather, and she turned to me and she said, I never thought I'd live to see the day where I buried one of my children. Um, and I remember looking at her and just like being unable to comprehend her pain. Honestly, like that's not the natural order of things. And I'm getting a little weepy here at my computer, but it's because I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old now, and and sons burying their daughters, sons burying their mothers, I beg your pardon, is a part of the natural order of things. I wish my mother would have been 75 when she died rather than 49, but that's the natural order of things. But parents burying their children is not that. And so Rembrandt, at the end of his life, had buried almost all of his children, and his life took on a very, very sad, sad period until his death. Rembrandt's most famous work is this. It's the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, and it was painted in 1632 when Rembrandt had not yet moved to Amsterdam. And this is one of the great, great objects in the history of Baroque art. It's nearly as famous as his masterpiece, which is called the Night Watch. And this image is important for it shows us some things that never could have happened in Italy during the same time frame. Dr. Tulp is on the right-hand part of our image. He's wearing a black hat, he's wearing a white collar, and he is holding the instrument that he's using to point to our cadaver whose feet lie on the lower right-hand side. You can see that there's a book in the lower part of the composition, and we actually know what book this is because of the text that Rembrandt himself owned. Tulp is shown wealthy. He's wearing a white collar. He's the only person wearing a hat, and that helps designate him in regards to social class. This painting depicts an actual event that happened once a year when Dr. Tulp, who is sort of like the Surgeon General of Leyden, would once a year give a public anatomy lecture. And public not open to everyone, but public open to a group of people. Those group of people are here watching, and because I was a physiology major in college, I can tell you that he has opened up the lower left arm and he has exposed the muscles and tendons of the the anterior part of the arm. So this is the palm side of the hand, right? And these are the flexors, which he's demonstrating. The person who they're dissecting here, I believe I remember his name correctly, it was Joseph Kidd. He was a recently executed criminal whose crime was thievery. Rembrandt has shown us the muscles and tendons of the lower arm with a remarkable sense of accuracy. This is not just kind of like red stuff and white stuff. That's the extensor, the flexor carpi radialis right there, my friends. He's actually done it because he has studied anatomy himself. And these people standing around him serve as a kind of group portrait, don't they? This is not just a collection of random heads. These are individual men who are all part of this. Their heads, like Franz Hall's, are on different lines. And some of them look at Tulp, some of them look at us, some of us look down at the cadaver. So this is also a dynamic kind of group portraits. Everyone chips in varying amounts to pay for the cost of the image. And then it goes not with Dr. Tulp, but somewhere else. We actually know who the men are because their names are on this sheet. Something else is present here. And you might not have seen it at first, but I got your back. Here it is. A date and a signature. It's kind of hard to make it out, and for this I apologize. It says Rembrandt. You can kind of make out the R there, and that's the D, and there's the T. And that thing right there, that's an F-I-T, Rembrandt Fekete, 1632. This is a good example of a Rembrandt self-portrait or Rembrandt group portrait, but he does lots. And this is his most famous painting. This is the Night Watch. And when you go and see it in person in the Rijksmuseum, it's a big, big work, and it pretty much occupies one whole wall. There's like a little study over here, and it's Rembrandt self-portrait over there, but this is absolutely given the place of honor. And it's a really fabulous image, and there's a way to really understand it. We have to know that this is, I think, what most people would call the Dutch national image. And in Amsterdam, there's an outdoor park. It's like called Rembrandt Park, and in that is a colossal statue of Rembrandt, and the rest of it are bronze statues that mimic the Night Watch. I don't know what the American equivalent is. I mean, it might be Grant Wood's American Gothic, right? That could be the American visual image. But I think, interestingly, I think I know what it is in regards to poetry, right? So I want you to think about, and maybe this is better for your teacher. Teacher, let me see what you got. Your teacher than all of you. What do you think the national poem of the United States is? It's remarkably unofficial. I can't imagine that there's ever been a vote on this. What's the most famous American poem? And the only one I can think of that would classify is Robert Frost's, like, two paths diverged in a woods, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all of the difference. I can't even tell you the title of that poem, but I know that line. So the familiarity that most educated Americans have with that line of that poem is the familiarity that all people in the Dutch Republic have of this image. It is their national image. And the sculpture is actually really cool because it's three-dimensional, right? This is how much I care about your experience in this class because I wanted to take this picture with no one in it. I had to wake up at 6 o'clock in a May morning to get out there before the hustle and bustle. So, hey, I care. I care deeply for you. Let's talk about this image because it's a really big, complicated one, and it's also gone through some changes. So it was originally bigger, but got cut down in time so they could fit into a room. And that's kind of sad. You shouldn't cut down paintings. But this, as a group portrait, shows a variety of people of different ranks and stations in life. And depending upon your rank and station in life, you would pay a different amount. So if you are a well-to-do person, this guy right here, his name is Colonel Cock, C-O-Q. He pays more because he's in the front of the composition and he's bigger than this guy right here whose head has been cut off by the arm, or this guy right here who's in the background, or this dude back here. He would chip in $10. He'd chip in 200 because he's a colonel. He's got more money than that guy who's only a corporal and he's got 10, right? In the image of our college, the College of Liberal Arts at Louisiana Tech University, the dean can chip in more money for this guy, for this head here, and our assistant professors back there or our instructors get that head, and our directors and associate dean get something like this. So this shows a nighttime scene, a kinda of a group of militia marching off in patrol, not necessarily war, but patrol. You can see they are wearing fancy clothing, they've got muskets, they've got spears. All of this was specific to Rembrandt's time frame. Even if Rembrandt had never picked up a paintbrush, he'd be known today as being one of the greatest etchers of his day. And etchings and engravings are really, really fabulous because they allow an art maker to sell art to more than just one person. And I'll give you an example of this. And it's something we didn't look at back when we were looking at the Renaissance because we really didn't do much north of Italy. But there's another engraver who's working in Germany during the early part of the 16th century, and his name is Albrecht Dürer. I'll give you some self-portraits of Albrecht Dürer, who certainly thinks highly of himself. So Albrecht Dürer was a German high Northern Renaissance painter who, in addition to painting, also did engravings. I want to show you an American art maker who you've never heard of before. His name is Gilbert Stuart. And Gilbert Stuart was born in Rhode Island, trained in England, went to Ireland, and eventually came back to New York, where he had the biggest goal of painting George Washington. So the picture of George Washington on the dollar bill, Gilbert Stuart painted that in 1793. Before he did that, he was in Ireland, and while there, he painted 6 members of the Protestant aristocracy in Ireland, and this was one of those. His name is John Lord Fitzgibbons, and this thing is fabulous. It's 8 foot by 6 foot. It's great. Now, I live in Ruston now, but before here, I lived in Dubuque, Iowa, and my first house in Dubuque was on 5th Street, or pardon me, Clark Drive, and then I moved to Fifth Street. This is the dining room of my house on Fifth Street. And I call your attention to this right there. And just in case you can't see it, there it is right there. That, my friends, is an engraving done in 1798 after a 1790 portrait by Gilbert Stuart. The engraver, his name is John Hodges. So I want to say something. This thing was bought by the Cleveland Museum of Art in the early 1990s. They paid $4 million for it, which I guess is pretty fair market value for a full-length Gilbert Stuart these days. I mean, it's not a lot of money compared to a Leonardo, but hey, it's Gilbert Stuart. And Gilbert Stuart is the most famous and accomplished American portraitist. Period, full stop, end of story. Well, maybe not the end of the story. Copley is good too, but Stuart paints for most of his life in the United States. And in 2002, in February of 2002, I found a 1798 mezzotint of it, and I bought it on eBay, and I won it on eBay. And guess how much I paid for it on eBay? Wait for it, 35 bucks. 35 bucks. As a matter of fact, this was the beginning of me buying mezzotints and engravings on eBay. And I think I have like 27 now. They're all framed. And every single one of them cost me a lot more to frame than I did on eBay. The moral of this story is pretty simple. I, as a starving PhD graduate student, could afford to buy that. And I, as a relatively middle-class associate dean, would never be able to afford to buy that. Engravings and etchings make art available to a brand new class of people. Middle-class people can afford engravings and etchings to this very day. And sort of on my wall, at home, and there was one of them on the image I just showed you, but now I have some prints from the American Art Union, which were made in the 1840s. Those are sold for $5. $5 is a couple $100 now. And a couple $100, once you have like a job, isn't really that much money, right? Like it's 2 nights in a hotel. It's 8 6-packs of beer. Like it's not that much money. And once you have a job, you can afford to save $200 to buy something. This was called the 100 guilder print. It was actually called Christ Sealing the Sick, and it was an etching that Rembrandt made and then sold for 100 guilders. I mean, it was quite literally like printing a $200 bill for him because it was about the cost of it. To give you an idea of $200, I just bought a new pair of Air Jordan sneakers, the kind I had when I was in middle school. They arrived yesterday. They were $200. So this is an engraving, a work of art made by an actual living, alive artist, and it costs about the same as a pair of shoes. This made art available, and it was also a way for an art maker to pretty much print their own money. Gilbert Stuart, the American artist I just showed you, sort of had a running joke that he did over 100 portraits of George Washington, and it was sort of like painting a $100 bill, because that's what he charged for it. And so Rembrandt, as an art maker, does engravings and etchings and sells them to a rising middle class, and that's a really, really important idea. Rembrandt is prolific. We have hundreds of Rembrandt engravings and etchings and hundreds of Rembrandt paintings. Rembrandt had a big studio, much like Peter Paul Rubens. And one of the things that art historians have been fighting through over the last 50 years is trying to figure out what is a Rembrandt and what's a Rembrandt student's painting. The other side of that is an art maker named Jan Vermeer, who has, as far as we know, only 32 known paintings. 32 is not a lot. That's only 32 more than what I've done. And so he's most famous for doing what we call genre paintings. Genre paintings are small, quiet depictions of everyday life. These things measure 30 inches by 25 inches. They're the size of a standard bust portrait. But Vermeer, Jan Vermeer, who was a Catholic working in Holland, it's strongly suggested by some scholars that he utilized something called a camera obscura. A camera obscura is kind of like an an old camera that uses a lens to focus light and reflect it onto a mirror where it can then be traced. So art historians have commonly believed that Vermeer might have used a contraption like this to accurately render a really, really specific, highly detailed interior space onto a piece of paper and use that as a way of tracing it. Um, if you're looking for an excellent 90 minutes of your life, you can find a film called Tim's Vermeer. Tim's Vermeer. It's a documentary about a man who's not an art maker but an inventor who is trying to figure out exactly how Vermeer did what Vermeer did because there's no record of Vermeer ever being trained as an art maker, right? He never enrolled in art school, never trained with a master, never was a member of the Art Makers Guild. And so this gentleman by the name of Tim tried to figure it out. You can find the film on Netflix. It's 90 minutes long, and it is absolutely worth your time. I want to show you some of the kinds of things that Vermeer was doing because we know when Vermeer moved houses because his paintings change. What you're looking at here are two paintings that are absolutely related. Same person, same interior space, in many ways, the same kinds of props. Vermeer painted these very small, quiet paintings, and they took him a long time, we can gather, because of the exceeding detail that's in them, and also the fact that he only did 32 of them. But this is a good example of what we call genre paintings. There's a sense of mystery about them sometimes. We don't quite know exactly what they mean, although the objects are filled with symbolic objects. I mean, this happens in still lifes as well, that, a bowstring, a broken bowstring is not just a broken bowstring, but it rather has a symbolic meaning. So too does a skull. So too does an overturned glass of water. And so Vermeer does these really quiet depictions of everyday life. He also does some landscapes, but by far the most famous landscape artist is an artist by the name of Jacob van Ruysdael. And what you're looking at here is one of his famous landscapes of the Dutch countryside. And my parents bought my mother's diamond in Antwerp. They were living in Germany at the time. And so they bought the diamond in Antwerp and then went to Holland. And my mother loved Holland. She loved things like um, wooden shoes and windmills and tulips and all that silly Holland Dutch stuff. And so windmills are all over Holland to this very day because they turn wind, which happens in a lot of places that are flat and below sea level, into mechanical energy. Like they're not just there. The wind blows this, the turning of this turns something in here this way, which turns a big millstone. So most windmills are actually flour mills, right? They grind wheat into flour, and then you can add, of course, yeast and salt and some water and make bread. Jacob van Ruysdael's landscapes are interestingly more sea and sky than land because Holland is practically underwater. I mean, they have dikes that hold back the sea. And so these landscapes are enormous but filled with sky. And they are small enough that you can afford them, right? And this seems like a silly thing to say, but what good is a landscape if it takes up an entire wall and you don't have space in it in your house and it's too much for you to afford? So what Van Ruysdael and his ilk realized, it's better to make things smaller. I can do more of them and I can sell more of them. It's easier to sell 10 small paintings than one big painting. And this is because of the rising middle class as it exists in Holland. I'll show you a couple of still lifes too, and then we'll get on our way. Peter Clauszoon is a great example of a still life painter, and I love this still life. It's because he fills it with so much cool stuff. This stuff has symbolic meanings. It's not just a random collection of things. They're things that have symbolic meaning. And the first really cool passage is this super shiny chromed sphere in which we can see an image of the artist painting here at the easel. And beyond that, the things that are here have a meaning that we can sort of decipher. For example, do you know what this is? It's kind of hard to make out, and a detail would make it a little more clear. But if I were to take off my watch and show you the backside of it, the backside has a crystal on it, so you can see the mechanisms of the watch. And it's a Swiss watch. It doesn't have a battery. It's wound every day by wearing it. So there's like a little what's called a column wheel on the back of it, and by working the watch on my wrist, it winds all of the mechanisms. And if you were to move it to a certain way, you can see all of the geary things that are in it. That is a pocket watch. Time. What's that? It's a feather. Time, feather, time, feather, time flies. Whew, time flies. What do we have here? A skull. We've looked at skulls before. Remember Masaccio's Holy Trinity? Skull, reminder of death. Time flies. The violin has a broken string, and this has traditionally been a symbol of the passage of time. We have a glass, and boy, talk about beautiful. Like, look at that. Look at the reflection of this. Like, that's your extra carded assignment for the day. Go draw that. All of this, the cracking of the nut, the overturned book, all of these things somehow speak to the passage of time. And this is called a vanitas still life. And a vanitas is kind of a memento mori, a reminder of death. Vanity, of course, is one of the cardinal sins, but it's also a reminder that the time on earth is short. And so these still lifes became very popular. And again, they're small. It's 2 foot by 18 inches, right? Easily affordable for you, the average I don't know, paper plant worker. This, my friends, wraps up Module 3 and the Baroque period more specifically. Our final module, module number 4, is going to start by looking at the art of the early 18th century. We call that period the Rococo, and we're going to wrap that module up by looking at the kinds of things that are happening in the middle of the century in the deserts of Nevada. Get ready, Module 4 coming soon.